Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when the world held its breath, when shadows grew longer than memory, when the very air seemed to whisper secrets that no living soul wished to hear. We walk alongside history's most profound teacher, the Black Death, that great dark wave that swept across the medieval world like twilight falling on an endless summer's day. But do not fear this telling, dear listeners, for even in darkness there are stories of quiet courage, of communities that held each other close, of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary grace in the face of the unknowable. This is not a tale of terror, but of transformation, not of endings, but of the slow, persistent way that humanity learns to begin again. The plague that arrived in the 14th century was more than disease. It was change itself, dressed in mystery, teaching medieval Europe that everything they thought they knew about their world could shift like sand between their fingers. But before we begin this journey together, if you find comfort in these ancient stones, then let this channel be your sanctuary. Click on that like button and subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it goes a really long way for me. Also, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. There's something comforting knowing others are here too, from different corners of the globe, settling into these old stories. Now dim the lights if you can. Let the glow of your screen become the flicker of candlelight. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Feel your breath begin to deepen, to slow, to match the rhythm of centuries passing like waves against an ancient shore. And let yourself sink quietly and gently into the past. Imagine, if you will, the Europe of 1340. A world moved to the rhythm of church bells and harvest seasons, where time itself seemed different, deeper, more patient than the hurried hours we know today. This was a world of stone and timber, of candlelight flickering against thick walls, of communities so small that everyone knew the sound of their neighbours' footsteps on morning cobblestones. Cities were intimate things then. London held perhaps 80,000 souls, Paris maybe twice that number, each person connected to their neighbours by threads invisible but strong, threads of shared feast days and common sorrows, of marriages that linked families like rivers joining into streams. The medieval world was vertical, reaching always toward heaven. Cathedral spires pierced the sky like prayers made visible, their stones carried upward by the hands of generations, fathers teaching sons the ancient craft of setting stone upon stone, creating spaces where light itself seemed to sing through coloured glass. In the countryside, life pulsed with the seasons. Spring brought the green rush of new barley, summer heavy with the weight of wheat, autumn golden with the promise of survival through another winter. Peasants worked land that their grandfathers had worked, following furrows worn deep by countless seasons, their lives bound to the earth by rhythms older than memory. Trade moved slowly then, but it moved. Merchants travelled roads that Roman legions had first carved from wilderness, carrying silk from distant China,
spices that had crossed deserts and mountains, stories that had gathered like dust on countless caravans. Venice grew fat on commerce with the East, its harbours crowded with ships that brought not just goods, but whispers of other worlds, other ways of being human. In monasteries scattered across the continent, monks bent over manuscripts, copying the words of ancient philosophers by candlelight, preserving knowledge like precious seeds through the long winter of the Dark Ages. Their quills scratched softly against parchment, each letter formed with the patience of prayer, each page a small victory against forgetting.
The people of this time lived intimately with mystery. They understood that the world beyond their village borders held wonders and terrors in equal measure. Maps ended in blank spaces marked, "Here be dragons," not from ignorance, but from honest acknowledgement that the world was vast and largely unknowable. Death was not hidden then, as it often is today. It lived among them, expected, accepted, woven into the fabric of daily life. Children learned early that some winters took the old, that some summers brought fever, that life was precious precisely because it was fragile. Graves were dug by neighbors, prayers were said by friends, mourning was a community act, shared like bread in times of famine. Yet, for all their familiarity with mortality, nothing had prepared them for what was coming. No grandmother's tale, no monk's learning, no merchant's travel stories could have readied them for the great teacher that was even then beginning its slow journey westward.
The Black Death was not born in Europe. Like so many profound changes in human history, it came from the East, from the vast steppes where Mongol horsemen had built an empire that stretched from China to the Black Sea, roads of conquest that would become highways for something far more transformative than any army. In the trading posts of Central Asia, in the caravanserai where merchants rested their camels and shared stories under desert stars, something was quietly changing. Rats were dying in unusual numbers, their tiny bodies discovered in storage rooms where grain waited for transport. But rats died often in those days. Their deaths seemed unremarkable, just another small mystery in a world full of mysteries. The merchants loaded their goods, the caravans moved on, the great wheel of trade continued turning, and with it, unseen, microscopic, patient as stone, travelled the future.
The year was 1347, and in the harbour of Kaffa, on the Black Sea's distant shore, something unprecedented was about to unfold. This city, a Genoese trading post at the very edge of Europe's imagination, had become a doorway through which the future would pass. Kaffa had weathered many storms. It had seen the rise and fall of empires, watched armies come and go like seasons. But in that autumn of 1347, a different kind of siege began. Not soldiers with swords and banners, but something invisible, patient, absolute in its purpose. The Mongol army that surrounded Kaffa's walls carried within their ranks a secret weapon they did not understand. Their warriors were falling, not to sword or arrow, but to something that crept through their camps like shadow through twilight. Bodies piled in their encampments, horses wandered riderless. The great war machine of the steppes was grinding to a halt before an enemy it could not see or understand.
In desperation, or perhaps in a moment of insight that would echo through centuries, the Mongol commanders made a decision that would reshape the world. They loaded their catapults not with stones, but with the corpses of their fallen, hurling the dead over Kaffa's walls like seeds cast into fertile ground. Inside the city, the Genoese merchants watched in horror as death rained down upon them. But these were practical men, traders who had learned to adapt to any circumstance. They cleared the bodies, burned what they could, and prepared to wait out the siege as they had so many others. But this siege would not be waited out. Within days, people within Kaffa's walls began to fall ill, not with the familiar fevers of winter or the stomach troubles that came from bad grain. This was something new, something that announced itself with swellings in the neck and groin, with skin that darkened like storm clouds, with a speed that left families no time to say goodbye. The surviving merchants, those hardy souls who had built fortunes by reading the wind and knowing when to sail, made the decision that would carry the plague westward. They loaded their ships with what goods they could salvage, with what people could still walk, and they fled. But they could not flee from what travelled with them. The ships that left Kaffa in the winter of 1347 were ghost vessels before they reached their destinations. Crew members fell ill during the journey, their bodies committed to the dark waters of the Black Sea, their prayers lost in the wind. By the time these ships reached the ports of Constantinople and Genoa, of Venice and Marseille, more dead than living remained aboard. Yet the ships kept coming. Trade, like water, finds its way through every crack, around every obstacle. The great commercial networks that had brought prosperity to medieval Europe now became highways for transformation. In October of 1347, 12 galleys from the east limped into the harbour of Messina in Sicily. Those who watched from the shore later remembered the silence, the way the ships seemed to drift rather than sail, the absence of the usual calls and shouts of arriving merchants. When the port authorities boarded these vessels, they found scenes that would haunt their dreams. Rowers slumped over their oars, merchants lying among their goods, cargo holds that reeked not of spices and silk, but of something far more final. Most of the crew were dead, and those who still lived bore upon their bodies the signs of something unprecedented. The authorities of Messina made a decision that seemed wise at the time. They ordered the ships away from port, refused to let them dock, commanded them to seek harbour elsewhere. But it was already too late. Death does not need permission to come ashore. Within days, people in Messina began to fall ill, the same swellings, the same darkening of the skin, the same terrible speed that gave families no time to prepare, no chance to understand what was happening to their world. From Sicily, the plague spread with the inexorable patience of tide. It followed trade routes like veins, moving through the great commercial cities of Italy. Florence, where Boccaccio would later write of streets empty save for the carts collecting the dead. Venice, where gondoliers learned to navigate not just canals, but grief itself. Rome, where even the Pope would flee his holy city. Each city fell in its turn, not to armies or siege engines, but to something that moved invisibly, that could not be negotiated with or bought off, that recognized no difference between noble and peasant, between learned and simple, between young and old. In Florence, the great banking houses that had financed kingdoms watched their clerks disappear from their desks, their ledgers left half-written, their coins unable to purchase what mattered most. The Medici, who would later reshape Renaissance art, lost family members whose names are now forgotten, whose stories died with them in those terrible months.
But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of those early months was the way communities that had held together for centuries began to unravel, not from lack of love, but from lack of understanding. How do you comfort the sick when you don't understand sickness? How do you bury the dead when the dead outnumber the living? How do you maintain faith when prayer seems to go unanswered? Families abandoned their own members, not from cruelty, but from terror so profound it overwhelmed every other instinct. Priests fled their parishes, doctors abandoned their patients, judges left their courts. The social fabric that had held medieval Europe together for centuries began to tear under the weight of something it had no words to describe. Yet even in this unraveling, there were threads that held. Stories emerged of monks who remained with their dying brothers, of mothers who refused to leave their children, of neighbors who brought food to families under quarantine. Love, it seemed, could survive even when understanding failed. By the spring of 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps into France, had sailed across the Mediterranean to North Africa, had followed the great rivers into the heart of Europe. What had begun as a whisper in distant trading posts had become a roar that would reshape civilization itself. The summer of 1348 found Europe in the grip of something unprecedented. A teacher so profound, so absolute, that it would reshape not just the bodies of those it touched, but the very soul of civilization. In Paris, the greatest city north of the Alps, King Philip VI watched his realm transform before his eyes. The Seine, that ancient river that had carried the boats of Roman traders and Viking raiders, now seemed to flow more slowly, as if weighted by the sorrow of the city it embraced. The University of Paris, where the greatest minds of Europe had gathered to debate theology and philosophy, fell silent, not from lack of questions, but from lack of questioners. Professors who had spent lifetimes parsing the mysteries of divine will found themselves facing a mystery that no amount of learning could unlock. In the great cathedral of Notre Dame, still under construction in those days, the master masons who had dedicated their lives to raising stone toward heaven
found their workshops emptying. The careful knowledge of how to balance flying buttress and pointed arch, how to coax light through coloured glass, how to make stone sing, this knowledge died with its keepers, lost as surely as if the books themselves had been burned.
The plague, you see, was not merely a medical phenomenon. It was a great unwinding, a patient teacher showing medieval Europe that everything they had built, every assumption they had made about how the world worked, could be undone by something so small it could not be seen. In London, along the Thames, where merchants had grown rich on wool and wine, carts moved through the streets with grim purpose. But these were not the usual carts of commerce. They were death carts, driven by men whose faces were wrapped against the smell, carrying bodies to mass graves that had been dug in fields beyond the city walls. The English, with their practical nature, tried to organize even this chaos. They appointed officials to count the dead, to maintain records, to impose some kind of order on the unprecedented. But the numbers grew too large for counting, the dead too numerous for individual graves, the grief too vast for any earthly accounting. In the countryside, where most of Europe's people still lived, the plague taught different lessons. Villages that had existed for centuries, places where the same families had worked the same fields for generations, simply emptied, not all at once, but gradually, family by family, until only empty houses stood as testimony to lives that had been lived and lost.
The harvest of 1348 rotted in the fields. Grain that had been planted with hope in the spring stood unharvested in the autumn, wheat and barley returning to the earth that had given them life. Cattle wandered through abandoned villages. Horses stood in fields where their masters would never return. Sheep scattered across hills that had lost their shepherds. Yet even in this great emptying, the plague taught lessons of unexpected mercy. In some places, the social barriers that had seemed as permanent as stone began to dissolve. Peasants found themselves working land that had belonged to lords. Surviving serfs discovered that they could demand wages for their labor, that scarcity had made them valuable in ways their ancestors had never imagined. In the monasteries, where monks had preserved learning through the darkest centuries, a different kind of accounting was taking place. Brother scribes, those patient guardians of knowledge, found themselves recording not just the wisdom of the past, but the testimony of the present. They wrote of empty scriptoria, of prayers said by fewer and fewer voices, of the strange silence that had settled over places where Gregorian chant had echoed for centuries. At the Abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris, where kings had been buried since the dawn of French monarchy, the chronicle records the deaths not just of nobles and peasants, but of something more precious, the death of certainties that had seemed as solid as the abbey's stone walls. The plague moved with its own mysterious logic. It would devastate one village while leaving the next untouched, would take every member of one family while sparing their neighbors completely, would empty entire monasteries while leaving others to wonder why they had been passed by. This randomness was, perhaps, the most difficult lesson of all. Medieval people lived in a world where everything was believed to happen for a reason, where suffering was understood as punishment, where survival was seen as evidence of divine favor. But the Black Death recognized no such patterns. It took the pious and the wicked, the generous and the greedy, the young and the old, with an impartiality that challenged every assumption about how the universe operated. In Germany, where the Holy Roman Empire struggled to maintain order across its vast territories, the plague's teaching took on darker forms. Communities that had lived in relative peace for generations began to turn on each other, seeking someone to blame for the incomprehensible. Jewish communities, already marginalized, became scapegoats for fears that had no other outlet. Entire communities were destroyed, not by plague, but by neighbors who could not accept that some suffering has no human cause, no human solution. The lesson here was perhaps the darkest of all, that humans, when faced with the unknowable, often choose the comfort of hatred over the harder truth of helplessness. But alongside these dark lessons came others, quieter, but perhaps more lasting. In Florence, a young man named Giovanni Boccaccio began collecting stories, not of the dead, but of the living. Tales of how ordinary people found ways to maintain their humanity even in the face of the unimaginable. His Decameron, written in the shadow of the plague, would become one of literature's great monuments to human resilience, proof that even in the darkest times, people find ways to tell stories, to share meals, to fall in love, to laugh at the absurdity of existence. In England, a contemporary wrote that the plague had made philosophers of peasants, that men and women who had never questioned the order of things found themselves asking the deepest questions about justice, about purpose, about what it means to be human in a world that seems indifferent to human suffering. By the winter of 1348, the plague had travelled from Sicily to Scotland, from Portugal to Poland, leaving behind a Europe that would never again be the same, not just because of who had died, but because of what had died with them. Old certainties, ancient hierarchies, assumptions about how the world worked that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. The great teacher had done its work, but the lesson was far from over.
Winter settled over Europe in 1348 like a merciful blanket, not because the plague had ended, but because it had taught its first, most devastating lesson, and now came the longer, subtler work of learning how to live in a world transformed. In the monasteries that had survived, monks found themselves the custodians of more than books and prayers. They had become the memory keepers of a civilization that had been partially erased. Brother Thomas at Westminster Abbey wrote in his chronicles of the strange silence that had settled over England, how even the birds seemed fewer, as if the natural world itself mourned the human emptiness. The Benedictines at Cluny, that great mother house that had spawned monasteries across Europe, faced a peculiar problem. They had preserved knowledge for centuries, copying manuscripts by candlelight, maintaining libraries that held the wisdom of ages. But now they found themselves with fewer brothers to do the copying, and a desperate need to record not ancient wisdom, but recent catastrophe. The plague had been selective in its teaching, sparing some while taking others with no pattern that human minds could understand. In some monasteries, every monk had perished, leaving only empty cloisters where Gregorian chant had once echoed through stone corridors. In others, a handful of survivors found themselves guardians of libraries they could barely maintain, custodians of traditions they struggled to continue.
Brother William of Ockham, that brilliant philosopher, whose razor would one day change how humans thought about knowledge itself, had died just before the plague reached England. His fellow Franciscans saw in this a kind of mercy, that he had been spared witnessing the collapse of the rational world he had helped to build. In the universities that survived, professors found themselves teaching to empty halls. The University of Oxford, which had trained the finest minds in England, saw its enrollment drop by more than half. Not just from death, but from a fundamental questioning of what learning meant in a world where the most learned physicians had been as helpless as anyone else. The medical schools faced the deepest crisis of all. For centuries, they had taught the theories of Galen and Avicenna, complex systems that explained how the human body worked, why people fell ill, how they might be healed. But the plague had made mockery of all such learning. The most skilled physicians died alongside their patients. The most elaborate treatments proved useless. The most ancient remedies offered no protection. A new humility was being born, not the humility of faith, which medieval people had always possessed, but the humility of ignorance, the recognition that there were aspects of existence that human knowledge might never grasp. In Paris, at the Sorbonne, surviving scholars began to ask questions that would have seemed almost heretical before the plague. If God's will was truly behind all events, why had the most devout suffered alongside the wicked? If prayer had power, why had entire communities of praying monks been wiped away? If knowledge was valuable, why had the most learned died while some illiterate peasants survived? These were not questions born of atheism, but of a faith trying to understand itself in the face of the incomprehensible. The plague had not destroyed medieval Christianity, but it had cracked it open, forced it to grow in directions it had never imagined. The economic consequences were perhaps easier to understand than the spiritual ones. In England, where detailed records were kept, royal officials calculated that perhaps 1/3 of the population had died. But numbers, however precise, could not capture what this meant for the texture of daily life. Villages that had supported 50 families now struggled to maintain 10. Mills stood idle because there was no grain to grind, no one to grind it for. Churches fell into disrepair because there were no longer enough parishioners to maintain them. Roads grew over with weeds because there were fewer travelers to keep them worn smooth. But scarcity, that old teacher, began to work its own transformations. In England, surviving peasants found that they could demand wages for their labor, that lords who had once commanded absolute obedience now had to negotiate for the services they needed. The Statute of Labourers, passed by King Edward III in 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, to force surviving workers to accept the same terms their fathers had accepted. It was a law that could not be enforced. When there are 3 jobs for every worker, the worker gains a power that no statute can legislate away. The plague had not just killed people,
It had killed the old relationships between people, the ancient certainties about who gave orders and who followed them.
In Florence, where the great banking houses had financed the ambitions of kings and popes, surviving merchants found themselves managing estates they had never expected to inherit. The Medici family, destined to become patrons of Renaissance art, built their fortune partly on property that the plague had left ownerless, investments that death had made available. But it was not just wealth that was being redistributed. Knowledge itself was changing hands. In scriptoriums across Europe, the careful craft of manuscript illumination was being simplified by necessity. There were fewer skilled artists to create the elaborate borders and miniatures that had decorated medieval books, but perhaps more importantly, there was a growing sense that knowledge needed to be accessible to more people. The University of Prague, founded just before the plague, found itself in the unique position of building a new institution in a transformed world. Its founders had envisioned it as a center of traditional learning, a place where young men would master the same texts that had been studied for centuries. Instead, it became a laboratory for new kinds of thinking, education shaped by the recognition that the old certainties might not be certain at all. In the towns and cities that survived, a new kind of civic consciousness was emerging. When traditional authorities, lords, bishops, guild masters had died in large numbers, surviving communities had to learn to govern themselves in ways their ancestors had never imagined. The city of Siena, which had been one of Florence's greatest rivals, found itself managing reconstruction with a reduced population and a transformed economy. The beautiful Palazzo Pubblico, with its soaring tower that had symbolized the city's ambitions, now looked out over a landscape that was subtly but permanently changed.
The plague's lessons were not confined to the Christian world. In the Islamic territories of Spain and North Africa, where it had arrived via the same trade routes that had brought it to Christian Europe, Muslim scholars and physicians faced the same crisis of understanding that troubled their Christian counterparts. Ibn Khaldun, the great historian who would revolutionize how humans thought about society and history, lived through the plague's devastation of North Africa. His later writings bear the mark of someone who had seen entire civilizations transformed by forces beyond human control, who had learned that history was not just the story of great men and their deeds, but of deeper currents that moved through human societies like underground rivers. The plague had been, in its way, the most democratic teacher in human history. It had given the same harsh lesson to king and peasant, to bishop and beggar, to the learned and the illiterate, and that lesson was this: that human beings, for all their knowledge and power and pride, remained utterly vulnerable to forces they could neither understand nor control. But alongside this lesson in humility came another, that humans, even in the face of the incomprehensible, found ways to continue, to adapt, to rebuild, to discover new possibilities in the ruins of old certainties. The world that emerged from the plague was not better or worse than the one that had entered it, but it was profoundly different.
and that difference would echo through the centuries, shaping the Renaissance that was coming, influencing the Reformation that would follow, contributing to the scientific revolution that would transform how humans understood their place in the universe.
As the plague's most acute phase passed, leaving behind a Europe that bore scars, both visible and hidden, a gentler but no less profound transformation began to unfold, like spring arriving not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of growing things finding their way toward light. In the English countryside, where entire villages had been abandoned, something unexpected was happening. Nature, that patient reclaimer of human spaces, began to work its quiet magic. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries slowly returned to meadow. Hedgerows grew wild and thick. Deer paths wound through what had once been market gardens. But this was not simply decay, it was transformation. The land, relieved of the pressure of supporting populations it could barely sustain, began to recover its strength. Soil that had been worked to exhaustion for generations lay fallow and slowly renewed itself. Forests that had been cut back to their last trees began to expand again. Surviving communities found themselves with resources they had never imagined. Pasture land that had been jealously guarded by lords was now available to whoever could use it. Common lands that had been overgrazed for centuries could now support larger flocks with fewer people to tend them. The mathematics of survival had fundamentally changed. In the monasteries that had survived, this abundance created its own challenges. The Abbey of Fountains in Yorkshire had been built to house 150 monks. Now it sheltered perhaps 30. The vast dormitories echoed with emptiness. The refectory that had once buzzed with quiet conversation at meals now seemed almost sepulchral in its silence.
But these surviving monks discovered something unexpected. With fewer mouths to feed and more land available, they could experiment with new forms of agriculture, new ways of managing their estates, new approaches to the ancient Benedictine principle of supporting themselves through their own labour. Brother John at Tintern Abbey wrote in his journal of the strange freedom that had come with loss. For the first time in the monastery's history, each monk could have his own cell, his own space for contemplation, his own corner of silence in which to pursue his relationship with the divine. In the towns and cities, the survivors faced different challenges. Canterbury, which had grown rich on pilgrims visiting the shrine of Thomas Becket, found itself with inns that could house far more travellers than now came. But rather than simply empty buildings becoming ruins, something creative began to happen. Surviving innkeepers converted their surplus rooms into workshops, spaces where craftsmen could practice their trades without the guild restrictions that had limited innovation for centuries. When there are too few people to maintain old monopolies, new possibilities emerge, almost by accident. The guilds themselves, those ancient organizations that had controlled every aspect of medieval crafts, found their power diminished by simple mathematics. When there are not enough surviving master carpenters to control who may work with wood,
when there are not enough surviving weavers to dictate the patterns of cloth, the careful barriers that had separated master from journeyman, from apprentice, begin to blur. In London, young men who would never have been permitted to practice certain trades under the old system found themselves essential to their community's survival. The worshipful company of goldsmiths discovered that they needed every skilled hand they could find, regardless of whether that hand had completed the traditional 7 years of apprenticeship.
This transformation of craft and trade was not uniform across Europe. In some places, surviving guild masters tightened their control, desperate to maintain the old ways in the face of change. But in others, particularly in the German states and the Low Countries, new forms of organization began to emerge, more flexible, more responsive to the realities of a world where skill had become more valuable than tradition. The changes in agriculture were perhaps the most fundamental of all. For centuries, European farming had been organized around the manorial system, great estates where peasants worked strips of land scattered throughout vast fields, their lives bound to the soil by obligations that stretched back to the earliest days of feudalism. But the plague had broken these ancient chains, not through revolution, but through simple depopulation. When half the peasants in a village have died, the surviving half find themselves in possession of more land than they can work using traditional methods. Innovation becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. In Normandy, surviving farmers began to experiment with new crops, plants that required less labor but could feed more people. The three-field system, that ancient rotation of wheat, barley, and fallow, gave way to more complex arrangements, experiments that would eventually contribute to what historians would later call the agricultural revolution. But these were not planned improvements imposed by great landowners or advised by learned scholars. They were the quiet innovations of ordinary people trying to survive in a transformed world, trying to make sense of abundance they never expected to possess. In the cities, the relationship between rich and poor was also shifting in subtle but important ways. The great merchant families, the Medicis in Florence, the Fuggers in Augsburg, and the emerging Hanseatic League in northern Germany found themselves operating in markets where labor was scarce and therefore valuable. A cloth worker in Bruges could now demand wages that would have seemed fantastic before the plague. A skilled mason could choose among several employers. A scribe who could read and write Latin found himself courted by merchants, nobles, and clergy alike. This newfound bargaining power of ordinary workers was not just about wages. It was about dignity, about the recognition that every person's contribution mattered in ways that had been invisible when people were abundant and easily replaced. The social hierarchies that had seemed as permanent as stone began to show cracks. Not dramatic fractures that would bring down kingdoms,
but hairline splits that would, over time, allow new possibilities to grow. In the intellectual world, the transformations were perhaps subtler, but no less significant. The University of Paris, where Thomas Aquinas had once synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, found itself home to scholars asking new kinds of questions. If the natural world operated according to principles that human reason could understand, why had the plague defied every attempt at rational explanation? If God's providence governed all events, why had the most devout suffered alongside the wicked? If knowledge was power, why had the most learned been as helpless as anyone else? These questions did not lead to the abandonment of faith or reason, but to a more humble, more questioning approach to both. The absolute confidence of the high Middle Ages gave way to something more tentative, more open to the possibility that human understanding might be limited in fundamental ways. The artistic world reflected these changes in ways both obvious and subtle. In the illuminated manuscripts that continued to be produced, though in smaller numbers, there appeared new themes, depictions not just of saints and kings, but of ordinary people, scenes not just of heaven and hell, but of daily life transformed by loss and recovery.
The dance of death, that haunting artistic motif that would become common in the later 13th century, showed death as a democratic partner, dancing with pope and peasant alike, reminding viewers that the plague had taught a lesson in equality that no earthly power could revoke. But alongside these memento mori came other artistic innovations, new attention to individual faces in paintings, new interest in the particular rather than the universal, new ways of seeing the world that valued the specific, the temporary, the irreplaceably human. In the scriptoria that continued to function, scribes began to experiment with new forms of script, styles that were easier to read, faster to write, more practical for a world where books needed to be produced more efficiently. The careful, elaborate scripts of the High Middle Ages gave way to forms that prioritized communication over decoration. This was not a decline in artistry, but a transformation of it, a recognition that beauty needed to serve new purposes in a changed world. By 1355, 7 years after the plague's first devastating sweep through Europe, a new kind of quiet had settled over the continent. Not the silence of death, but the deeper silence of a world learning to listen to itself with different ears. In the Cathedral of Chartres, where the most beautiful stained glass windows in Christendom cast their coloured light across stone floors, the few remaining canons found themselves custodians of more space than they knew how to fill. The great nave, built to accommodate crowds of pilgrims, now echoed with the footsteps of a handful of worshippers. But this emptiness was not mere loss, it was also possibility. In the vast, quiet spaces of the cathedral, individual voices carried further. Individual prayers seemed to resonate more deeply. Individual moments of contemplation expanded to fill the silence that surrounded them. The surviving clergy had learned new ways of being present to their diminished flocks. Where once a priest might have served a parish of 300 souls, he now tended to perhaps 100, but tended to them with an intimacy that had been impossible in the crowded world before the plague. Father Benedict at the village church of Little Wickham wrote in his journal of the strange blessing that had come with loss. He knew each of his parishioners now not just by name, but by story, by the particular shape of their grief, by the specific texture of their hope. Ministry had become not a matter of administering sacraments to crowds, but of walking alongside individuals through their daily struggles with mortality and meaning. In the great libraries that had survived, scholars worked in a silence that was both profound and productive. The library of the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland had lost half its monks, but none of its books. The surviving brothers found themselves guardians of more knowledge than they could possibly master in their lifetimes. This abundance of books relative to readers created new possibilities for scholarship. Where once a monk might have spent years waiting for access to a particular manuscript, now he could spend months or even years with a single text, absorbing not just its explicit teachings, but its subtler meanings, its connections to other works, its place in the great conversation that had been continuing across centuries. Brother Thomas Aquinas the Younger, not the great Thomas, but a monk who had taken his name in honor, spent 3 years working through a single copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics, not because he was slow, but because he had the luxury of time that his predecessors had never possessed. His marginal notes, discovered centuries later, revealed a depth of engagement with ancient philosophy that would have been impossible in the busier world before the plague. In the secular world, similar transformations were taking place. The court of King Edward III of England, once a bustling centre of politics and diplomacy, now functioned with a smaller but perhaps more efficient group of advisers. Decisions that had once required elaborate consultations among dozens of nobles could now be made more quickly, more directly. This was not necessarily better governance, but it was different governance, more personal, more immediate, more responsive to the realities of a world where every surviving person represented irreplaceable knowledge and experience. The economic transformations were perhaps most visible in the great trading cities. Venice, that jewel of the Adriatic, found its famous Piazza San Marco less crowded but no less magnificent. The surviving merchants discovered that they could conduct business with an intimacy that had been impossible when the square was packed with traders from every corner of the known world. Deals that had once been shouted across crowded marketplaces could now be negotiated
in quiet conversation, partnerships that had once been formal contracts between strangers became personal relationships between people who knew each other's families, each other's stories, each other's dreams. In the workshops of the guild craftsmen, the transformations were both practical and spiritual. Master Giovanni, the goldsmith of Florence, found himself working with just 2 apprentices instead of the dozen he had employed before the plague. But this smaller workshop allowed for a different kind of teaching, more personal, more thorough, more attentive to the individual gifts of each student. The apprentices, in turn, found themselves learning not just techniques, but philosophy, not just how to work with gold, but why beauty mattered, what it meant to create objects that would outlast their creators, how the act of making could become a form of prayer. In the countryside, the new silences were perhaps most profound. Villages that had once buzzed with the activity of large extended families now functioned with smaller, quieter rhythms. Children played in fields where once there had been too many children for the available space, their laughter echoing across landscapes that seemed to have expanded to accommodate fewer voices.
The agricultural work continued, but at a different pace. Farmers who had once worked frantically to extract every possible grain from overworked soil could now afford to be more patient, to let fields rest longer, to experiment with crops that required more time but yielded better results. This agricultural transformation was not planned by any central authority. It emerged organically from the simple mathematics of fewer people and more land. But its effects would be felt for centuries, contributing to improvements in nutrition, in agricultural techniques, in the relationship between human communities and the natural world. In the monasteries, the reduced numbers of monks created space for new forms of spiritual experimentation. The Abbey of Cluny, which had once housed hundreds of brothers, now sheltered perhaps 50. But these 50 had access to resources, spiritual, intellectual, material, that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors. The monastic day, once rigidly structured around the needs of large communities, became more flexible, more responsive to individual spiritual needs, more open to the possibility that different souls might require different approaches to the divine. These new silences were not empty silences. They were full of possibility, pregnant with the seeds of changes that would not become fully visible for generations. The Renaissance that was coming, the Reformation that would follow, the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding, all of these had their roots in the quiet transformations that followed the plague. But perhaps most importantly, these silences taught the surviving Europeans a new appreciation for the preciousness of human life, not in the abstract, but in the particular. When every person represents irreplaceable knowledge, every voice
carries weight that cannot be duplicated, every relationship becomes a treasure that must be carefully tended. The world was learning to listen more carefully, to speak more thoughtfully, to value the spaces between words as much as the words themselves. And in that learning lay the seeds of a future that would be both haunted by loss and enriched by the wisdom that loss had made possible. As the immediate crisis of the plague faded into memory, as the empty spaces began to fill with new life and new possibilities, Europe entered into a phase of the deepest learning of all, the slow, generational work of understanding what had been lost, what had been gained, and what it meant to be human in a world that had been forever changed. In the scriptoria of surviving monasteries, a new kind of chronicle was being written, not the usual accounts of kings and battles, of treaties and conquests, but something more intimate, more personal, records of how ordinary people had lived through extraordinary times. The chronicle of Brother Matthew at Worcester Abbey contains entries that read less like historical records and more like letters to the future, attempts to preserve not just what had happened, but what it had felt like, how it had changed the texture of daily life, the weight of morning prayers said by fewer voices, the echo of footsteps in corridors that had once been crowded. These chronicles reveal something remarkable about human resilience. They speak not of heroic resistance to catastrophe, but of the quieter heroism of continuation, of people who got up each morning and tended their gardens, who baked bread and taught children, who found ways to maintain the small rituals that make life meaningful even when the larger meanings seemed uncertain.
In the towns and cities, a new form of civic memory was emerging. The guilds that had survived began to commission works of art, not just to beautify their halls, but to commemorate what had been lost, to ensure that future generations would remember not just that the plague had happened, but that real people with real names and real stories had lived through it. The Cloth Guild of Bruges commissioned a series of panels showing not just the saints and biblical figures that had traditionally adorned guild halls, but portraits of guild members who had died, ordinary weavers and dyers whose faces were preserved in pigment and gold leaf, whose stories were carved into the margins of official records. These commemorative works were not morbid monuments to death, but celebrations of life, reminders that every person who had been lost had been irreplaceable, that communities were built not just of buildings and institutions, but of individual human beings whose absence left specific, unclosable holes in the fabric of daily existence. In the universities that had survived, a new approach to learning was emerging. The scholastic method, with its elaborate disputations and systematic treatises, gave way to something more personal, more experimental, more willing to acknowledge the limits of human knowledge. At the University of Oxford, Master John Duns Scotus the Junior, following the naming pattern of that era, began to teach philosophy not as a system of certain knowledge, but as a way of living thoughtfully with uncertainty, of finding wisdom not in answers, but in better questions, of understanding that the most important truths might be those that could not be proven, but only experienced. This intellectual transformation was not a retreat from reason, but a deepening of it, a recognition that reason itself was a gift that needed to be used with humility, that the human mind, for all its power, was still a small thing in a vast and mysterious universe. In the political realm, the transformations were subtler, but no less significant. Kings and nobles who had survived found themselves ruling over territories that were both diminished and somehow more manageable, populations that were smaller but perhaps more closely connected to their leaders.
King Edward III of England, in his later years, spoke of the strange intimacy that had come with loss. Where once he had ruled over millions of subjects who were mere numbers in royal records, he now governed a kingdom where individual voices carried more weight, where the death of a single skilled craftsman or learned clerk could be felt throughout the realm. This was not necessarily more democratic governance, but it was more personal governance, rule that had to take account of the irreplaceable value of individual lives and individual skills. The absolute monarchy of earlier centuries began to give way to forms of government that were more consultative, more responsive to the needs and voices of surviving subjects. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in the realm of faith. The Christianity that emerged from the plague years was not a different religion, but it was practiced differently, understood differently, experienced differently by people who had been forced to confront the fundamental mysteries of existence in new ways. The great cathedrals still stood, still drew pilgrims, still offered the same sacraments that had been offered for centuries, but the faith that was practiced within their walls had been deepened by an encounter with the unknowable, enriched by an experience of loss that had taught new lessons about what it meant to trust in divine providence. Saint Julian of Norwich, that remarkable mystic who lived through the plague years, wrote of receiving visions that spoke directly to the spiritual questions raised by the catastrophe. Her revelations of divine love offered not explanations for suffering, but assurance that suffering could be held within a love larger than human understanding, that all shall be well, not because bad things don't happen, but because even the worst things could become part of a larger story of redemption. Her writings, copied and recopied by hand, spread through Europe not as official church doctrine, but as personal testimony. One person's witness to the possibility of finding meaning even in the face of the meaningless, hope even in the midst of despair, love even in the presence of death.
In the Jewish communities that had survived the plague and the persecutions that followed it, a different but parallel transformation was taking place. Rabbis and scholars who had lost entire communities found themselves preserving traditions for smaller groups, teaching Torah not to crowded study halls, but to handfuls of students who represented the fragile continuity of centuries of learning. The Talmudic commentaries, written in the generation after the plague, carry a particular poignancy. Discussions of legal and ethical questions that acknowledge the practical realities of communities that had been devastated. Interpretations of ancient texts that had been forced to grapple with unprecedented situations. These commentaries reveal a tradition learning to bend without breaking, finding ways to maintain essential truths while adapting to radically changed circumstances, discovering that faithfulness sometimes required innovation, that preservation sometimes demanded transformation. As the 14th century drew to a close, as the children who had been born after the plague began to have children of their own, Europe found itself home to a new kind of human being. People who had inherited not just land and titles and traditions, but also the memory of catastrophe, the knowledge that everything they took for granted could be swept away, the wisdom that came from living in the shadow of loss. This was not a traumatized generation, but a deepened one. People who valued life more highly because they understood its fragility, who built communities more carefully because they knew how easily they could be destroyed, who practiced faith more humbly because they had learned the limits of human understanding. The Black Death had been more than a plague. It had been a teacher, a transformer, a force that had reshaped not just the demographics of Europe, but its very soul. And the lessons it had taught would echo through the centuries, informing the Renaissance, shaping the Reformation, contributing to the scientific revolution, helping to create the modern world with all its possibilities and all its challenges.
And so we come to the end of this long journey, this walk through the shadows of the 14th century, this meditation on one of history's greatest teachers and the profound lessons it left behind. The Black Death did not end with the passing of the plague. It lived on in the empty spaces that were slowly filled, in the new silences that taught people to listen more carefully, in the changed relationships between individuals and communities, between humans and the natural world, between the living and the dead. In the ruins of abandoned villages, wildflowers bloomed where market squares had once buzzed with commerce. In the empty halls of monasteries,
individual prayers echoed with new resonance. In the transformed cities, smaller communities discovered intimacies that crowded generations had never known. The people who lived through those years learned something that each generation must learn anew, that life is both more fragile and more resilient than we imagine, that communities can be broken by forces beyond human control, but that the human capacity to adapt, to continue, to find meaning in the midst of loss, is stronger than any plague. Tonight, as you rest in your own warm spaces, as you listen to these whispered memories of centuries past, perhaps you can carry with you some of the quiet wisdom that the Black Death left behind. The knowledge that every ordinary day is a gift, that every person you encounter carries irreplaceable stories, that the small rituals of daily life, the shared meals, the evening conversations, the morning prayers, are the threads from which the fabric of civilization is woven. The medieval world that entered the plague years was not the same world that emerged from them, but it was still a human world, still a place where people fell in love and raised children and told stories and created beauty and sought meaning and found ways to hope even in the darkest times. The Black Death taught Europe that everything could change, but it also taught that some things, love, courage, faith, the human capacity for community, could survive even the most profound transformations. And perhaps that is the gentlest lesson of all, whispered across the centuries, carried on the wind that blows through empty churches and recovering forests, spoken in the silence between heartbeats, that we are more fragile than we know and stronger than we imagine. Sleep well, dear listeners. May your dreams be filled not with the darkness of distant centuries, but with the quiet light that always finds its way back to the world, no matter how long the night has been.